the y-intercept? What's the place where it crosses the y-axis? And what's the place where it crosses the x-axis? And I get those points just by asking two questions. I say, one, what if beer equals 0? And then the second question I ask is, what if cigars equals 0? Since I know I have two goods, I can just quickly say, what if one is 0, what if the other one is 0? And when I solve for that, it gives me those y and x coordinates. So taking the first one, what if beer equals 0? That means you've got a formula here where you see beer, just make it 0. And so that means cigar equals 20 minus 2 times 0, which is just going to be 20. So that means plot that coordinate, you find where beer is 0, that's right there. Where cigar is 20, that's up there, and so that's your first coordinate. And it happens to be that y-intercept for both the U.S. and Cuba. And then I say, what if cigars equals 0? That means I just go up to this equation, wherever I see cigars, I put 0. So that means cigar 0 equals 20 minus 2 times beer. Cigars falls out. The only thing that's left is beer. So I solve for what beer is. I just take the minus 2 times beer, bring it to the other side of the equation. Then you have to just solve for beer. You get beer equals 20 equals 10. Which means here we got to find where cigar equals 0 and beer equals 10. Cigars are here, 0, beer 10, right there. So that goes to that point, across the 2. Just connect those points and you got it. You can do the same thing for U.S. If you do that a couple times, you end up where you can just look at those equations and just do it really quick. Is it best if I just like start here and just go through the whole homework? Is that easy? It's okay.
So do you want us to use triangles and circles, squares?
Wait,
Okay.
you'll see. Okay. I'll always tell you what I want.
All right.
If you didn't pay attention to the announcements, you might have... Actually, let me hold off on that. One of the main purposes in doing these lines and using those equations is to get these opportunity costs of producing one thing versus another. And I'll show you 2 ways I'll do that. Can I erase those? I'm going to do like last time. I'm going to work out the answer for Cuba, and you can just write down the answer for U.S. and see if you can get it yourself. 12 and 13, asking about the opportunity cost, just write down the answer is 1 for both. And then I'm just concentrating on Cuba. You can do Cuba, you can do the U.S. Number 14, 15. For Cuba, what's the opportunity cost of producing 1 beer? 15 was the opportunity cost for Cuba producing 1 cigar. You can do this in one of 2 ways. You can look at the graph and figure it out by going from one point to another, or look at the equation. I'll do the equation first, and then I'll go to the graph and show you. But to do the graph, you got to make sure that this is plotted on your piece of paper if you do it. Number 14 is asking about for Cuba opportunity cost of 1 beer. And then what we're asking is saying, if we produce one more beer, how many cigars do we have to give up? And I tend to just look at this equation and I think, what if beer goes up by one? What happens to cigars? And, I just look at that, and if it goes up by one, that change in one is multiplied by -2. And so cigars falls by 2. If that isn't immediately apparent to you, just imagine this. 20 minus 2. Suppose you have no beers, then you would have 20 cigars. Now suppose you want to go from 0 beers to 1 beer. Now you have 18 cigars. To get that 1 beer to go from 0 to 1, you have to go from 20, 18 cigars, so cigars went down by 2. Of course, you can get that looking at the graph too. Like if I come over here and I say, suppose cigars, let me actually do this. In your graph, go ahead and put a circle for Cuba at 10 cigars and 5 beers. So I've got this circle right there, 10 cigars, 5 beers. Put that circle on yours too. I'm going to use that as a starting point. You'll see in a minute that I have to give you that point. I'll tell you what that point is. Starting here, supposing we're at 10 cigars and 5 beers. Suppose I say I want to get 1 more beer. That means I want to go from 5 to 6 beers. To do that, to go from this point, 5 beers to 6 beers, I have to go from 10 down to 8 cigars. And so I just go from one point to another, and you can do it from any point here. You just increase beer by 1, you say how much does cigars go down by, and it goes down by 2. And that's why we say the opportunity cost of producing 1 beer is 2 cigars. And then 15, the opportunity cost of producing 1 cigar. You can answer that in the same way, going through the same thought experiments, or you can just remember that this has to be the inverse of that. If that is 2, that must be 1/2. If that was 3, that must be 1/3. But if I answer it the same way, say, 15, if I just look at this equation and I think I'm getting 1 more cigar, how much does beers have to go there? I look over here, I picture this going up by 1, and the only way that can go up by 1 is if this side of the equation goes up by 1. The only way that can happen is if there's a -1/2 times -2 gives you a 1, and so there would have to be a -1/2 of beer. Now, if you're not used to doing it like that, you probably weren't able to follow that, but it's a lot easier on this graph. If you come over here, say we start from 10 cigars and 5 beers again, and we say, suppose we want to get 1 more cigars. How many beers do we give up? We go to 10 cigars, 5 beers, and then we say, let's go from 10 cigars to 11 cigars. And to do that, we go to this point right here, and when I go down, that's 4.5. So we went from 5 beers to 4.5 beers. We give up a 1/2 beer. And so that's why I have a 1/2 beer down there. But I'd say for test, to go through it quick, just do the first one, the one that's easiest. To me, the one that's easiest is the one that's on the right-hand side of the equation. And then you do the And you can often memorize these things. You can just say, well, whatever's on the right-hand side here, the opportunity cost is whatever's multiplied by 2. So put 2. And the U.S. equals 1. So it's 1. I'm going to come back to that this writing right here. I want to skip down to here. This whole exercise is about going from autarky, where we don't trade, to trade, where you do trade. And if you didn't pay attention to the announcements in class, you wouldn't have known what to put in this table. This starting point, where in autarky, how much they produce and consume, meaning before trade, at what point, where on these lines they are. I always have to tell y'all that, and I always will. I could have you come up with numbers, but I would never do that on tests. I'll always tell you where to start. So what I did is, in some announcements I said, for the homework in autarky, make sure you start where the U.S. is producing 10 cigars, 10 beers, and Cuba is producing 10 cigars, 5 beers, and then I said denote that as a circle on the graph. That's why we have those circles on the graph. I'll go to it in a second. But you want to fill out the table just like this. Autarky means no trade, so exports and imports are zero. And the only thing you consume is what you produce. In the announcements I said do a circle for that, for where you produce and consume before trade. So that's why you have a circle at 10 and 5 for Cuba and at 10 and 10 for U.S. Once we go to trade, countries have to decide what they're going to specialize in. They're going to specialize in one or another. And you would have put this in your notes from when we did similar worksheets in class. You might want to put it on this sheet for when you get it back you can study. But as far as what they're going to produce, countries always produce, once they trade, what they have a comparative advantage in. You do what you do best when you trade with other people. You do your comparative advantage. I've got down here, U.S. has CA in beer. The CA stands for comparative advantage. And this is why I said that. If I want to ask, who has the comparative advantage in beer? I'm asking who can produce beer at the least cost. Who can produce one beer and give up the least number of cigars in doing so? Well, for the U.S. to produce one beer, they have to forego one cigar. For Cuba to produce one beer, they have to forego 2 cigars. So we produce beer at the least cost. So we have a comparative advantage in beer. You would probably think, if you think cigars and beer, you're going to think, well, U.S. is more likely to produce beer than cigars. But don't just assume it's going to be like that. Like if I want to test and see whether you really understand that, I can switch this and make it so that you end up concluding things that you don't normally see in the world, like saying the U.S. concentrates in cigars. That doesn't sound right. That's not what we see out there, but I can make the problem reflect that if I wanted to see if you really understand it. And likewise for Cuba, we say, who has a comparative advantage in cigars? Who can produce it at the least cost? The U.S. has to give up 1 beer for every cigar they produce. Cuba has to give up only a half a beer for every cigar they produce. And so Cuba has this comparative advantage in cigars. It will never get tricky here. There will never be It cannot be the case where one country has a comparative advantage in both.
Comparative advantage is just simply put who has the cheapest cost of making one or the other.
So once you know who has comparative advantage in one good, you can always just assume it'll be the other group that has comparative advantage in the other. That's the information that we will use to answer number 17. In 17, it's saying, now suppose we engage in trade. Oh, good, I even tell you, I say, we will learn that when countries trade, they will produce the good for which they possess a comparative advantage. The good with the lowest opportunity cost is only that good. If this is the case, write down the answer, then I'll go back to the graph to show it. U.S. will produce 0 cigars and 20 beers, while Cuba will produce 20 cigars and 0 beers. I'm going to show you this on the graph real quick. Please tell me if I ever go too fast doing this. We all have short attention spans, so I'm trying to get the homework done before we see. And the announcements would have said, show me where they produce in the graph at the trade. Now, we already said that the U.S. has a comparative advantage in beer. So when they trade, U.S. will produce only beer. Well, if the U.S. produces only beer, that means they're producing 0 cigars, so we're down here, and they're producing only beer, so they must be producing 20 beer. That's why I have that rectangle. That's where they're producing at the trade. Likewise, if Cuba is producing only cigars, beers are 0, so cigars must be up there at 20. And you'll want to make sure, like if you don't have different colors, you'll want to maybe do triangle then subscript US to make sure that I know that you know that that's the US point of production. Triangle subscript, or just write the word Cuba and draw a line to it. But you want to make sure you label things clearly. We're trading now. We know how much each group is producing. And then I tell you a trade that they make. I say, suppose that Cuba trades 10 cigars for 7 beers. Meaning Cuba exports 10 cigars and imports 7 beers from the U.S. And then you have to come in and build the table. As far as production, you already know what's going on there. They're going to do what they do best. U.S. produces no cigars, 20 beers. Cuba produces no beers, 20 cigars. As far as exports and imports, you just have to listen to what I tell you. I'm telling you, Cuba trades 10 cigars. That means of the 20 cigars, they're going to export 10. So Cuba cigars exports 10. They're importing 0. So if they produce 20 and they export 10, that means they have 10 left over to consume themselves.
How is that on the U.S. though, the cigars? Is that they're exporting 10, but they're producing 0?
Shouldn't that can be an import?
Yeah, it should.
Okay.
Doesn't you get an import?
Yeah, the U.S. is importing 10 cigars. As far as beers, they're producing 20, exporting 7, so they have 13 left over to consume themselves. Let me get these numbers. Then comes the gains from trade. I'll show it to you on this table, then we'll put it on the graph. This is before trade, this is after trade. The U.S. goes from 10 cigars to 10 cigars, so the same number of cigars. U.S. goes from 10 beers to 13 beers. So they got 3 more beer. So we can, for number 20, we can go ahead and answer number 20. At the trade, the U.S. gains 3 beers and 0 cigars relative to our target. Number 20, U.S. gains 3 beers and 0 cigars.
Wouldn't the US be gaining the cigars after the trade, not the beers? Because we're exporting the beers, right? So, I guess I'm confused on that part. Because wouldn't we be gaining the cigars rather than the beers?
Well, we were producing cigars ourselves.
Oh, I see.
So basically, Cuba's producing cigars that we used to produce.
Right.
For Cuba, they were consuming 10 cigars, they're still consuming 10 cigars. No gained cigars. They were consuming 5 beers, now they're producing 7 beers, so they gained 2 beers. At the trade, Cuba gains 2 beers and 0 cigars.
Oh, I see.
So they got something for nothing. They got more beer without giving up any cigar. Something they could have never done by themselves. By themselves, the only way they can get more beer is to give up cigars. Can you get something for nothing? Just a short answer, yes, by trading. It is a free lunch. For number 21, it wants you to indicate the point of consumption for the U.S. after trade. In the class announcements, I told you I wanted you to use rectangles for that. And that's where these rectangles come in. The red rectangle for Cuba shows you there are 10 cigars, 7 beers. Green rectangle or square for U.S., 10 cigars, 13 beers. And when we go from that circle to the square, that's showing both countries getting more beer without giving up any cigars. So this is just replicating the worksheet that we did in class with some different numbers. And I could on an exam have you do worksheets like this, but if I want a simpler way of that, to make it like multiple choice questions, I would do it more like this. Where I show you, in this example, a PPF curve for the U.S. and for the European Union, and then there's some multiple choice questions about which one is the right formula. And then you just have to infer. Answer I got was A. Do y'all want me to go into detail on that? Or do you?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Okay. I find that the best way to answer this, and it's a very quick way too, is just, you can just look at the PPF curves and tell really quick what the numbers of the formula are. We'll look in here, so we have meat on the y-axis, veggies on the x-axis. And we've got U.S. and EU. Meat is going to equal some intercept plus some slope parameter times veggies. This is the case for both of them. If you haven't done this kind of thing a lot, for a test, you might want to actually really write out the equation to make sure you're doing it right. And this intercept is easy. It's just a number when veggies equals 0. When veggies equals 0, you're over here. So you're just picking off the y-intercept. For the US, you just look, and the y-intercept is 200. And for the EU, you just look at it, it crosses the y-axis at 100. And then you probably remember from high school doing rise over run a lot. You can just look over here and say, see what the rise over run is. For the US, you go from one point to another, like when you go from here to here, you go from 170 to 180. That's an increase of 10. From 170 to 180, you go from here to here, which is 30 to 20. That's negative 10, negative 1. That just means this number right here must be negative 1. And when you come to the EU to do the rise over run,